The morning mist clung to Brooklyn Heights like a shroud, but it would not be enough to hide the catastrophe unfolding below. General George Washington stood motionless atop the fortifications, his weathered hands gripping the wooden parapet, as he watched 23,000 British and Hessian soldiers systematically destroy his Continental Army on the plains of Long Island. It was August 27, 1776, and the revolution was dying before his eyes. The thunderous roar of cannon fire echoed across the East River as Major General William Howe's forces executed their masterful flanking maneuver. With surgical precision, what had begun as a defensive stand to protect New York City had transformed into a nightmare of tactical miscalculation. Washington's 9,000 Continental soldiers, many barely trained farmers and tradesmen, found themselves outmaneuvered by one of Europe's most experienced military machines. Brigadier General John Sullivan's forces crumbled first along the Gowanus Road. The Delaware and Maryland regiments, positioned to guard the crucial Jamaica Pass, had been overwhelmed when Lord Cornwallis's columns struck at dawn. The sound of their retreat men shouting, muskets crackling, drums beating the retreat carried across the battlefield like a death knell for American independence. Colonel Edward Hant's Pennsylvania riflemen fought desperately from behind stone walls and farmhouse ruins, their long rifles picking off British grenadiers with deadly accuracy. But skill could not overcome numbers. For every redcoat that fell, more appeared through the morning haze, their bayonets gleaming as they advanced in perfect formation. Across the rolling farmland of Brooklyn, the Jamaica Pass had been the key to everything, according to historical accounts from the New York Historical Society. This crucial mountain gap had been left virtually unguarded by American forces, allowing British General Henry Clinton to lead 10,000 men through the darkness and strike the Continental Army from behind. The catastrophic oversight would haunt American military planning for generations. Washington's aide-de-camp, Colonel Joseph Reed, approached with grim news from the front lines. General, Sullivan's men are in full retreat. The British have taken the pass and are driving our forces back toward the heights. His voice carried the weight of impending defeat. Sir, we may lose the entire army if we remain here. The commander-in-chief's jaw tightened as he surveyed the tactical disaster unfolding. Before him, British light infantry had seized the high ground along the Gowanus Heights, their artillery now commanding the entire battlefield. American soldiers streamed back toward the Brooklyn fortifications, in growing disorder, many without weapons, their uniforms torn and bloodied from the morning's fighting. Through his spyglass, Washington could see the scarlet ranks of the 42nd Foot advancing methodically through the wheat fields, their officers mounted and directing the assault with calm professionalism. These were not the untested colonial militiamen his forces had faced at Lexington and Concord. These were veteran soldiers who had campaigned across Europe, disciplined warriors who moved like clockwork across the battlefield. The trap was closing. With inexorable precision, British warships commanded the East River, their massive guns trained on any vessel that might attempt to ferry American troops to safety in Manhattan. Lord Howe's fleet had positioned itself to cut off all escape routes, while his brother's army pressed the attack from three directions simultaneously. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the battlefield, Washington faced the most critical decision of his military career. His army, the only organized force capable of sustaining the rebellion, was trapped with their backs to the water, facing annihilation at the hands of the world's most powerful military. Night fell over Long Island like a black curtain, but it brought no respite from the horror of defeat. Within the American fortifications on Brooklyn Heights, wounded soldiers groaned in the darkness while their comrades prepared for what seemed certain to be their final battle. Washington moved through the earthworks like a specter, his tall frame barely visible in the flickering light of concealed campfires. The British encampment stretched across the plain below, their cooking fires twinkling like malevolent stars in the darkness. General Howe had chosen to pause his assault, confident that morning would bring the complete surrender of the Continental Army. His decision to halt the attack rather than press his advantage would prove to be one of the war's most consequential moments. Captain Alexander Hamilton, serving as an artillery officer with the New York Provincial Company, approached Washington near the American battery overlooking the Gowanus Creek. The young West Indian's uniform was torn and powder-stained from the day's fighting, but his eyes burned with fierce determination. "General, the men are asking when we fight our way out," he said quietly. "They know we cannot hold these lines against a full assault." Washington studied the terrain that had become their prison. The Brooklyn Heights fortifications, hastily constructed over the past month, formed a rough semicircle with both flanks anchored on the East River. Behind them lay nearly a mile of dark water separating them from Manhattan and safety. Before them, 23,000 enemy soldiers waited for dawn to complete their victory. Major Benjamin Town, Adge's Connecticut Dragoons had brought disturbing intelligence. From their reconnaissance patrols, British engineers were already digging approach trenches, preparing for a formal siege that would reduce the American position to rubble within days. Worse still, Admiral Richard Howe's warships had moved closer to shore, their guns trained on the ferry landing where any evacuation attempt would have to begin. The Council of War convened in Washington's headquarters tent was a gathering of desperate men. Brigadier General Nathanael Greene lay fevered and delirious from illness, unable to contribute his tactical expertise when it was needed most. General Israel Putnam, the old Indian fighter from Connecticut, advocated for a breakout attempt at dawn. Better to die fighting than surrender like sheep, he growled, his weathered hands gesturing toward the enemy lines. But Colonel John Glover of the Marblehead Regiment had a different proposal. His Massachusetts fishermen and sailors, veterans of countless Atlantic crossings, possessed skills that might prove invaluable in their current predicament. General Glover said carefully, "My men know these waters. We've sailed every tide and current between here and Manhattan. If we could gather enough boats." The audacity of the suggestion struck the assembled officers like lightning. Evacuate 9,000 men across a mile of water, under the noses of the Royal Navy's most experienced commanders? The British fleet included ships of the line mounting dozens of heavy guns, vessels that could turn any evacuation fleet into floating coffins within minutes. According to records preserved in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress, Washington spent the night of August 29th wrestling with this impossible decision. Every military manual warned against attempting a withdrawal in the face of a superior enemy, particularly across water where a single mistake could doom the entire force. Yet the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant the end of American independence before it had truly begun. The Continental Congress had invested everything in this arm of their treasure, their hopes, and their sacred honor. If Washington's force was destroyed or captured on Long Island, no power on earth could revive the rebellion against British rule. As midnight approached, Washington made his choice. He summoned Colonel Glover and gave him orders that would echo through history. Gather every boat, barge, and vessel you can find. We evacuate the army tonight. The order spread through the American ranks like wildfire carried on a summer wind. Colonel John Glover's 14th Continental Regiment, the Marblehead Mariners, moved with purposeful urgency through the pre-dawn darkness, their knowledge of wind and tide transforming them from ordinary soldiers into the saviors of American independence. These Massachusetts fishermen had spent their lives battling North Atlantic storms and navigating treacherous coastal waters. Captain John Russell and his crew of weathered seamen understood better than any general that success depended not on courage alone, but on reading the subtle signs of weather and current that could mean the difference between salvation and catastrophe. The evacuation fleet assembled at the Brooklyn ferry landing was a motley collection of vessels that would have seemed laughable under different circumstances. Fishing boats designed for cod and mackerel runs, merchant sloops built for coastal trading, even rowboats and canoes pressed into service anything that could float and carry men. Across the East River to Manhattan shores docked Captain William Bradford's artillery company worked frantically to disguise their movements from British sentries posted less than 200 yards away. The massive siege guns that had defended Brooklyn Heights throughout the battle posed the greatest challenge. These bronze cannons, each weighing more than 2 tons, could not be left for the enemy, yet moving them without detection seemed impossible. Major Aaron Burr volunteered to lead the most dangerous phase of the operation. His New York Volunteers would maintain the illusion of normal garrison activity along the forward trenches, while the main force quietly withdrew to the landing. The young officer understood that discovery meant certain death for his men, but the Continental Army's survival hung in the balance. The first boats pushed off from Brooklyn at 11 o'clock on the night of August 29th. Captain Thomas Knowlton's Connecticut Rangers, who had fought so gallantly during the day's retreat, now found themselves cramped into fishing smacks designed for half their number. The vessels rode dangerously low in the water, their gunwales barely above the dark surface of the East River. Navigation in the absolute darkness required skills that only lifetime mariners possessed. The Marblehead men guided their overladen craft by feel and instinct. Sensing wind shifts and current changes that remained invisible to landsmen, Captain Caleb Gibbs's personal guard surrounded Washington. As his boat moved silently across the water, the commander-in-chief's distinctive profile carefully concealed beneath a dark cloak. British warships loomed like sleeping giants in the river channel, their massive hulls black against the star-filled sky. HMS Phoenix and HMS Rose, ships of war mounting 40 guns between them, lay anchored within cannon shot of the evacuation route. A single alert sentry or the creak of oarlocks at the wrong moment could trigger a bombardment that would illuminate the river in deadly orange flame. The tide turned against them at 2 in the morning, forcing Glover's mariners to fight both current and time as they ferried load after load of Continental soldiers to safety. According to maritime records held by the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, the Marblehead Regiment's knowledge of local tidal patterns proved crucial in maintaining the evacuation schedule throughout the night. General Israel Putnam remained at the Brooklyn fortifications until nearly dawn, personally supervising the withdrawal of the rear guard. The old veteran knew that panic would doom the entire operation, so he moved through the trenches like a calming presence, joking with nervous soldiers and ensuring that defensive positions remained properly manned until the last possible moment. Captain Hamilton's battery continued firing at measured intervals throughout the night, their cannon shots echoing across the water to convince British listeners that American forces still occupied their positions at strength. The young artillery officer had calculated the precise timing needed to maintain the deception, while conserving precious gunpowder for the battles that lay ahead. As the eastern horizon began to show the first pale hint of dawn, nearly 8,000 Continental soldiers had reached Manhattan safely, but 1,500 men still waited on the Brooklyn shore, including the most critical rear guard units whose discovery would expose the entire evacuation to devastating British retaliation. Dawn crept across Long Island with agonizing slowness, but instead of the clear morning that would have spelled doom for the American evacuation, an extraordinary meteorological phenomenon began to unfold. A thick fog, dense as wool and white as fresh snow, rose from the warming waters of the East River and spread across Brooklyn Heights like a divine benediction. Major Benjamin Talmadge, still holding the forward trenches with his Connecticut dragoons, watched in amazement as the mist thickened around his position. British sentries barely 50 yards away vanished into the gray wall, as completely as if they had never existed. The fog was so dense that Talmadge could barely see his own hand extended at arm's length. This was no ordinary morning haze that would burn off with the rising sun, but a maritime fog bank that had rolled in from the Atlantic Ocean during the night, according to meteorological studies documented by the National Weather Service. Such dense fog formations occur when warm, moist air masses encounter significantly cooler water temperatures, exactly the conditions present in New York Harbor during late August of 1776. Colonel John Glover seized the opportunity with the instincts of a seasoned mariner. The fog that blinded British observers also provided perfect cover. For the final phase of the evacuation, his Marblehead men redoubled their efforts, ferrying the remaining Continental soldiers across the East River in boats that moved like phantoms through the impenetrable mist. Captain Daniel Neal's company of Pennsylvania riflemen found themselves among the last units still holding the American lines. These backwoodsmen, accustomed to stalking deer through mountain forests, adapted quickly to the fog-shrouded battlefield. They maintained their firing positions until the final moment, their occasional musket shots convincing British listeners that the Brooklyn Heights fortifications remained fully manned. Washington himself remained with the rear guard, refusing to board an evacuation boat until every last soldier under his command had reached safety. The commander-in-chief moved through the fog-wrapped trenches like a guardian spirit, personally ensuring that no wounded man was left behind, and that military supplies were either evacuated or destroyed to prevent their capture. General Howe's forces, meanwhile, remained completely unaware that their enemies were vanishing into the mist. British and Hessian sentries reported normal activity from the American positions. Throughout the morning hours, cooking fires still burned in the Continental camp, and the regular exchange of musket fire between pickets suggested that Washington's army remained trapped and awaiting surrender. The fog grew even thicker as the morning progressed, creating an almost supernatural atmosphere over the battlefield. Soldiers reported that they could hear voices and footsteps moving through the mist, but could see nothing beyond a few feet in any direction. The The ghostly conditions unnerved veterans of European campaigns who had never experienced such dense maritime fog during combat operations. Captain Alexander Hamilton supervised the evacuation of his artillery pieces. With methodical precision, the young officer had devised an ingenious system for moving the heavy cannons silently across the wooden planking of Brooklyn's docks. Pieces of cloth wrapped around wheel hubs and gun carriages muffled the sound of metal against wood, while teams of horses moved at walking pace to avoid the telltale clatter of harness that might alert British listeners. By 9 o'clock in the morning, only 300 American soldiers remained on Brooklyn Heights. These final defenders volunteers, who had accepted the most dangerous assignment of the war, maintained their positions in the fog-shrouded trenches while Glover's boats made their last runs. Across the East River, Colonel Edward Hance, Pennsylvania, riflemen formed the ultimate rear guard, their long rifles ready to cover the final withdrawal. These mountain men knew that discovery meant certain death or capture, but they held their ground with the stoic courage that had made them legendary. Throughout the Continental Army, the fog showed no signs of lifting as the morning hours passed, creating a window of opportunity that no military planner could have anticipated. Nature herself seemed to have intervened on behalf of American independence, providing the concealment necessary for one of the most audacious military evacuations in history. General George Washington stood at the Brooklyn ferry landing as the last boat prepared to depart, his tall frame barely visible through the supernatural fog that had saved his army from annihilation. Around him, the final remnants of the Continental rear guard moved like specters through the mist, their footsteps muffled by the thick marine air that continued to blanket Long Island. With providential concealment, Colonel John Glover approached. Through the gray wall, his weathered face creased with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. "General," he reported quietly, "the last of the artillery is aboard. Only your personal guard remains on Brooklyn soil." The Marblehead Mariner had orchestrated one of the most successful military evacuations in recorded history, ferrying 9,000 Continental soldiers to safety under the noses of the world's most powerful navy. The fog had held throughout the critical morning hours, defying every expectation of weather and season. British and Hessian forces continued their siege preparations less than 200 yards away, unaware that their quarry had vanished into the mist like morning shadows. The sound of enemy voices carried clearly through the heavy air, their conversations conducted in the casual tones of men confident that victory was assured. Major Ehrenberg's New York volunteers had maintained their deception until the final moments, keeping fires burning in the abandoned Continental camp and occasionally firing muskets to suggest continued occupation. The young officer's theatrical skills had proven as valuable as any military training, convincing British observers that Washington's army remained trapped and desperate within the Brooklyn Heights fortifications. Captain Caleb Gibbs's personal guard surrounded their commander as he prepared to board the final evacuation vessel. These Virginia riflemen had sworn to protect Washington with their lives, and they maintained their vigilant watch even as safety beckoned from across the dark waters of the East River. Their loyalty would be remembered long after the fog lifted, and the true scope of the night's achievement became clear. The last boat pushed off from Brooklyn at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, its hull riding low under the weight of the Continental Army. As most senior officers, Washington remained standing in the stern, his gaze fixed on the misty shore where so many of his soldiers had fought and died for the cause of American independence. The fog swirled around them like a protective shroud as they disappeared into the gray channel. Behind them, the Brooklyn Heights fortifications stood empty and silent, their earthworks and wooden palisades abandoned to an enemy that remained completely unaware of the dramatic reversal that had occurred during the night. Cooking fires still smoldered in the Continental camp, while discarded equipment and personal belongings created the illusion of an army still in residence. The miracle of the fog had provided more than concealment. It had granted the Continental Army a second chance at independence. Without this meteorological intervention, the revolution would have died on the shores of Long Island, crushed beneath the overwhelming military superiority of the British Empire. Instead, Washington's forces lived to fight another day, their morale intact despite the tactical defeat they had suffered. Colonel Edward Hance, Pennsylvania riflemen were among the final soldiers to reach Manhattan, their long rifles still loaded and ready for action despite the successful withdrawal. These frontier veterans understood better than most how close they had come to complete disaster. The fog had been their salvation. transforming certain defeat into the foundation for future victory. As the evacuation fleet scattered across the East River toward Manhattan's shore, the dense maritime fog began to show signs of thinning along the western horizon. Patches of blue sky appeared through the gray overcast, harbingers of the clear weather that would soon reveal the empty American fortifications to their astonished enemies. The timing could not have been more perfect. Every Continental soldier who could be saved had reached safety, along with their weapons, ammunition, and artillery pieces. Not a single cannon had been abandoned to British forces, denying General Howe the military supplies he needed to press his advantage and pursue the retreating Americans to Manhattan. According to historical records maintained by the New York Historical Society, the successful Long Island evacuation would be remembered as Washington's finest hour as a military commander, demonstrating the strategic thinking and personal courage that would ultimately lead America to independence. The fog had lifted just enough to reveal the outline of Manhattan's shore when Washington's boat touched the dock. At the foot of Fulton Street, behind them, Brooklyn Heights remained shrouded in mist, concealing the magnitude of their escape for a few precious hours longer. General William Howe stood in his command tent reviewing the final plans for the assault that would crush American resistance once and for all. The morning fog had delayed his intended dawn attack, but the British commander felt no urgency. Washington's Continental Army was trapped with no possibility of escape, and a few hours' delay would make no difference to the inevitable outcome. Colonel James Grant of the 40th Foot approached through the lifting mist, his scarlet uniform immaculate despite the damp conditions. "Sir," he reported confidently, "the approach trenches are nearly complete. We can begin the bombardment within the hour and have their fortifications reduced by evening." The veteran officer had commanded British forces through European campaigns and saw nothing in the American position that suggested serious resistance. The fog began to dissipate more rapidly as the late morning sun climbed higher, revealing patches of the battlefield that had remained hidden since dawn. British and Hessian soldiers prepared their weapons with methodical precision, anticipating the slaughter that would follow their assault on the weakened Continental positions. Captain John Montreser, chief engineer of His Majesty's forces in North America, had spent the night calculating the precise trajectory needed for their artillery to breach the American earthworks. His mathematical expertise, honed through years of siege warfare, indicated that 6 hours of concentrated bombardment would render the Brooklyn Heights fortifications untenable. But as the marine fog continued its retreat toward the Atlantic Ocean, disturbing reports began reaching British headquarters from forward observers. Lieutenant William Sutherland of the Royal Marines had been monitoring American activity through his telescope since before dawn, but the thick mist had limited his observations to occasional glimpses of movement and the sound. "A voice is from the Continental trenches. Something's amiss, sir," Sutherland reported to his company commander. "I've heard no activity from the lines for the past hour. No voices, no movement, not even the usual musket fire between pickets." The young officer's unease grew as more of the American fortifications became visible through the dissipating fog. Major General James Robertson, military governor of New York, had positioned his headquarters to overlook the entire Brooklyn battlefield. As the fog lifted, he raised his spyglass to study the Continental positions that should have been bustling with desperate activity. Instead, he saw only empty earthworks and abandoned cannon positions. The realization struck the British command structure like a thunderbolt. The American fortifications were completely deserted. Cooking fires still smoldered in the Continental camp, and military equipment lay scattered about as if the defenders had simply vanished into the morning mist. But no soldiers remained to defend the position that had seemed so impregnable just hours before. General Howe himself strode to the forward observation post, his confident demeanor evaporating as he surveyed the empty American lines through his telescope. The tactical situation that had seemed so favorable at midnight had been completely reversed by an evacuation that military theorists would have deemed impossible. "Under the circumstances, they've escaped," Howe said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of strategic opportunity lost. "The entire Continental Army has escaped across the East River during the night." The British commander understood immediately that his careful plans for crushing American resistance had been thwarted by an operation of extraordinary audacity and skill. Captain Friedrich von Munchausen of the Hessian forces was among the first enemy soldiers to enter the abandoned American fortifications. The German officer found evidence of the hasty evacuation everywhere. Personal belongings scattered in the mud, cooking pots still warm over dying fires, and defensive positions that showed clear signs of recent occupation. Admiral Richard Howe received the news aboard his flagship HMS Eagle with profound dismay. The Royal Navy's complete control of New York's waterways had been rendered meaningless by an evacuation conducted under cover of fog and darkness. His brother's carefully coordinated land and sea operation had been outmaneuvered by colonial fishermen in small boats. The strategic implications of Washington's escape became clear within hours. The Continental Army, battered but intact, had preserved the organized military force necessary to continue resistance against British rule. What should have been the decisive battle of the American Revolution had instead become a demonstration of colonial resourcefulness and determination. British intelligence officers immediately began investigating how such a massive troop movement could have occurred without detection. The answer lay in the combination of natural phenomena and maritime expertise that had transformed certain defeat into miraculous salvation. The fog that had frustrated their assault plans had provided perfect concealment for the most audacious military evacuation in modern warfare. The empty fortifications on Brooklyn Heights stood as mute testimony to one of the war's most remarkable reversals of fortune.